guys, we're back for another breakdown of Devs. We're at episode 5. This is an episode framed entirely by Katie watching projections, which is very weird, but also very, very interesting.
There's a lot to get into there, but first, of course, we're getting the spoilers for the whole season up through episode 5, so if you're not caught up or you haven't watched, go watch it and then come back. And as always, if you enjoy what we're doing, please subscribe to GameSpot Universe for more breakdowns. Like many of the episodes before it, this episode opens with a montage. We see Lily in the hospital. It zoomed in on the flowers for a little while, which made me think like maybe Kenton like put a bug in the flowers because there's sort of this like smarmy note on the flowers from Kenton. But then I remembered that the devs unit can just like watch anyone anywhere doing anything, so a bug would literally be
but it does kind of
pointless.
add to Kenton's like Cold War spy flavor, if that is true. Like, I would be really excited if that were the case.
But then it picks up right where the previous episode left off, which was Kenton about to do some serious damage to Jamie.
This whole sequence stressed me out so much, it like made my stomach churn. I can like barely watch it. It was so... I don't know if it's just because I really like Jamie and I want the best for him and I feel bad that this is all happening to him, or if it's just like the violence in this show is so visceral. Even though it's kind of sparse, like it's not gory and it's not necessarily like ultra violent or anything, but it's so hard to watch.
The violence is very matter of fact, right? It feels, if we talked about this relating to the fight in episode 2 between Kenton and Anton, and it feels more real because of that. And I also liked the sort of way that this room was set up with the laundry bin knocked over, the stuff strewn about the floor, the blood on the edge of the toilet, which Kenton has Jamie in the bath. I thought it was interesting that this has been going on long enough that he poured a bath. And it made me think, like, I wonder if he waited for the water to heat up or if it's just freezing cold in there.
Probably it's, I'm going to guess it's freezing cold.
How much does Kenton really care? But as far as we saw, the only damage to Jamie that actually happens on camera is the breaking of the finger.
I hate it.
Well, I hated it because he broke his gaming hands. You know?
Yeah, he can no longer
you need both hands. He broke his gaming finger, so he's gonna be even worse at Dark Souls now.
Yeah.
But we don't know where the blood on the toilet came from. Like,
it's
Jamie. By the time we enter the scene, Jamie is like already just basically just a broken shell of a person, just like shivering. And unable to speak.
I assume, like, in my head, I mean, I think that that's the point, is that, like, whatever we imagine is worse than what probably actually happened. So, like, in my head, it's, like, Kenton, like, slamming his head against the toilet seat or something, like, horrible like that, and it's awful. Like,
But he doesn't have, there's no head
right,
wound or
I know,
anything.
like, it doesn't actually make sense, but that's where my head's going, and that's why it's, like, so hard to think about. I don't like it at all.
Poor Jamie.
Poor Jamie. Then we get a scene of a flashback to Lily and what we can immediately assume is her father. If you remember from last episode, we learned that her father died of heart disease when she was young. And I love that this scene adds so much context to what little we know about Lily's past. I mean, obviously we've had like the very cursory details kind of laid out, but this whole scene really implies like how hard that her father's death would have hit her. And they're playing Go, which is kind of like chess or checkers. It's with the black and white tiles, which in my mind is very symbolic. You know, you've got like light and dark pieces working. I don't exactly know how to play Go, but I do know for sure it's like black and white trying to balance each other out, which I feel is, you know, pretty weighty and symbolic in the moment.
And also the idea of thinking several moves ahead is clearly an idea that was instilled in her by her father. It puts a lot of her actions from the past several episodes in context. Like it tracks with the idea that she would come up with this scheme and she would involve her friend Jen, like before the audience would even know about it, where she's gonna fake all these episodes and this fake history that she has. Like her plan made sense and it tracks with this flashback to her childhood that we're seeing. My question, and this relates to the whole episode, is why is Katie watching this?
Right. Yeah, no, I don't know exactly what Katie is getting from any of this, except for, I mean, later in the episode we kind of get a little bit of context as to Katie's history, which makes me think that maybe she's watching this almost in the same way that Forrest is watching the moments, and that like she wants confirmation that the tramlines are intact, and not only that she's making the right choices, that, you know, she is, like, doing the things that need to be done, maybe?
Throughout the episode...
I don't know, it was very weird.
Throughout the episode, the expression on her face sort of subtly changed. Like, Alison Pill is such a good actress, and maybe I was projecting onto her, but I felt as if she was starting to feel more and more strongly throughout the episode. It seemed like she was starting to feel remorse. In the first episode, when everything goes down, we don't know these characters very well. We don't know their histories. We don't know anything about their relationship. And now, the more we learn about them, the more painful that is in retrospect. And maybe if it's having that effect on me as the viewer, maybe it's having that effect on Katie as well. Like, she doesn't seem like a sociopath.
She doesn't seem like a sociopath, but at the same time, she does feel like very driven towards what her goal may be. And I had a thought kind of later in the episode, when we get a flashback to her specifically, that I think might color my entire idea of what this episode is doing, and that all of the projections are crystal clear. Like, she's watching these projections, but they're perfect. So we know that she's using the modifications that both she and Lyndon applied to their system.
Yeah, the Everett model.
Yeah, exactly. The many worlds interpretation, because we know that achieves crystal clarity. And so in my head, I'm not sure how much we can trust what she's watching, because I think that she might be watching, like, alternate realities, maybe?
Right, so we see later in the episode, like, as she's leaving the lecture, for example, we see the many versions of them, presumably that she's changing, she's just tweaking tiny variables and getting different versions of these events, right? Take that when you rewatch the episode and you go back to Katie watching Lily playing Go with her father, and then there's scenes where Lily is sitting there with nobody across from her and she's playing. And the first time through, I took that as, you know, this is just a linear story we're watching unfold. Her dad is gone. But in retrospect, those scenes could just be alternate versions, and Katie could be watching a version where Lily's dad didn't die. In episode 4, she said her dad died when she was 10. In that scene, she seems older than 10. So we don't even know if that's one linear timeline that Katie's watching, or if those are just different branches, you know, where the event of her father's death did or did not take place. A lot of what Katie is watching this episode is flashbacks to earlier moments in Sergei and Lily's relationship. We get them meeting. We also get the scene where they're in bed, where they tell each other that they love each other for the first time. And it was adorable.
I'm in love with you.
But I think there's also, like, some significance to the movie they're watching, maybe.
I did. It took a little time, but I did some research and figured out exactly what movie they're watching. It's called The Third Man. It's a 1949 British film noir movie starring Orson Welles. And the speech that they're actually listening to is Orson Welles' character named Harry. He's delivering the speech that is basically about acceptable collateral damage.
Victims? Don't be melodramatic. Look down there. Would you really feel any pity if one of those dots stopped moving forever? If I offered you 20,000 pounds for every dot that stopped, would you really, old man, tell me to keep my money? Or would you calculate how many dots you could afford to spin?
Which is very clearly an allegory for kind of what's going on in the devs unit. Like, what is acceptable collateral damage to let, you know, Forrest's vision live on? What, you know, how many Sergeis have there been in, you know, the process of making this super powerful computer? And also, not in the clip, but further in the monologue from the movie, I found another interesting line, which was,
the world doesn't make any heroes.
When you put that in the context of this show, I think it's really fascinating, because you have, you know, the senator kind of coming to Forrest being like, you literally could become, like, a hero to the nation, you could become a hero to science, or what have you, if you were to apply the things that you have in this way. And Forrest just being like, well, that, I don't care. Which, you know, is really selfish, but also, I think, very honest.
Yeah, I think initially in the show I would have said Forrest clearly has a god complex. He thinks that he can kill people, and as long as it furthers his goals or whatever. But Forrest clearly is scared of that side of himself. Like, he knows that killing people is wrong. Like, he also is not a sociopath, and he's terrified of the idea that he's a magician, as they said in the last episode, right? If anything, it feels like this monologue that we're overhearing in this movie applies more to Katie.
Mm-hmm.
We see it in the scene where she's at the lecture in college. She's aggressive, she's dogmatic, she's firm in her beliefs. If anybody is on that path, it's her, I think.
Yeah, she's definitely the zealot of the whole crew. Like, she's the one who, I think, without Forrest being there to kind of temper her, she's the one who's going to go off the rails, which is terrifying.
Speaking of Katie in college, I think this is one of the most illuminating scenes that we've had in this series. The initial experiment that her professor is talking about is the dual slit experiment, and that is a real thing. And the interesting takeaway from that is the idea that the act of observing the particles changes their state. And the question that I immediately had from that I wrote down in my notes was, does the act of observing the timeline also change the timeline? Like, does that apply to this as well? And that's the question that Forrest that's the question that Forrest and Katie were asking in the previous episode, and that's why Forrest is continually watching these projections of the future to make sure it hasn't changed. And maybe why Katie's doing the same thing.
I'm too fucking stupid for this show, is what I have gotten
Me too.
from, like, the amount of, like, TED Talks and Wikipedia pages and just content I've had to consume to, like, have what I assume is just the most cursory understanding of what is actually being discussed and talked about. Like, in this scene, it feels like they rattle off, like, there's, like, 4 different actual real life, like, quantum physics things happening here. There's, like, the Copenhagen interpretation, the Penrose interpretation, the von Neumann-Wagner interpretation.
Yeah, I'm looking at my notes, and the Copenhagen interpretation is the idea that it's the act of measurement that affects the particles. The Penrose interpretation is the idea that it's caused by space-time curvature somehow, which is also, like, related to wormholes and possible time travel theories. The von Neumann-Wagner is the idea that it is human consciousness itself which somehow is a force being exerted on the particles. And this is what Katie, college age Katie, takes such a big issue with. And this is Forrest manipulating the professor with whom he's friends into deliberately aggravating Katie so he can gauge her reaction.
Whatever. Enjoy, dweebs.
As we learn later, the professor says she's the brightest student she's ever had, but she's not going to be able to pay for college. The professor clearly went to Forrest for help here, and he's willing to, but he's like testing her first, right? Like, but she doesn't even know it.
Yeah, she has no idea. This whole scene was very interesting to me because also we get to see Katie give a very passionate defense of the Everett interpretation, which we know from last episode is what both she and Lyndon applied to the system to make it work. And so it's fascinating to me that Forrest had such a positive reaction to Katie, like, basically, like, caping in for the Everett interpretation, which is literally the many worlds thing, which is what Forrest hates.
It works.
It does not work!
It's really interesting because Lyndon is the one who took the Everett model that Katie is such a big proponent of in this scene and applied it to the quantum computer within devs. It wasn't Katie, and they've been, doing these experiments for years, and it's interesting to me that it was Lyndon who did it. So it says to me at some point, maybe Forrest convinced Katie that the Everett interpretation actually wasn't the way to go, and then, Lyndon applying it and having it work so well kind of to Katie is like, oh, I was right. Even though we didn't really get the sense of that last episode, except at the end when she says, well, I applied the Everett interpretation, and now you're going to see this crystal clear video of your daughter and you're going to break down Forrest. But there's no smugness to that in the sense of I told you so.
Right. This moment is actually what made me start thinking that maybe these projections may not be completely faithful to the reality that we've seen thus far. And so this made me think, I was like, wait a minute, is Katie watching a version of events that Forrest that subscribes or at least doesn't hate the Everett interpretation as much as the Forrest that we've seen in episodes 1 through 4? which is wild.
When she's leaving the lecture and we see the many versions of her, there's many of her and there's only one Forrest, right? Which fits with their worldviews again of she subscribes to the multiple branches. So clearly she's looking at different versions. Right. Because this is all framed as things that she's watching. My question is, you know, when it comes to a conversation like the lecture scene or the conversation between Forrest and Katie, we are only seeing one version of it. And so if the version that is being shown to the audience is some alternate branch and not the life that these characters have actually lived, what is the narrative purpose of that?
Yeah, that is, I mean, that's where my understanding is getting a little bit blurry, because it feels like on one hand it's very much endorsing the fact that, like, we know that the Everett interpretation works, so in that respect it makes me think that the show is kind of endorsing the idea that, like, the many worlds, like, interpretation or the many worlds theory is maybe more healthy or at least, like, psychologically sound than just pure determinism, which is kind of something that I thought later on in the episode when Katie and Forrest have a conversation, which we will get to. I don't know thematically where it would actually come in that we would have to do all of this kind of mental gymnastics to see which one is correct or which one is, like, the actual real version.
I think it would be so confusing. For certain scenes, I think that we need to move forward with the show operating under the assumption that certain key things that we're seeing are the version that happened within the timeline in which we've existed for the course of the show so far. Like, for example, the car accident is the way that it happened, I think, and then the other versions that she's seeing are different possible branches where the cars swerved around each other in different ways or whatever.
Yeah, I think but also at the same time, in my head, this also could mean that, like, the version that is happening in history is somehow breaking down. Like, the reality around these events is becoming more and more fragmented, which I think also would kind of fit within the narrative of the show, in the sense that something bad is going to happen. Like, we know that, like, Lily's going to die. We know that things, like, everyone's very tense and afraid of the tram lines breaking. So maybe this is the show showing us that the tram lines are breaking. Back at the devs unit, we get more context added to that gross mummified rat we saw last episode. This time it is freshly dead, so slightly less gross, and surrounded by a skull, like a bird skull, a clock, a flower, a feather, a shell, and a sugar cube, which are some Illuminati level wackiness happening here. Yeah. But we actually get to kind of learn what's happening and why that mummified rat was even there, in the sense that we get to see the machine doing what the machine, I believe, is intended to do, which is scan every object within its kind of vicinity or on its weird little summoning table. It does look like a demonic summoning table. I don't know. Yeah. But it's scanning these items to a molecular level, which in theory, and because we saw back before Sergei died with the nematode, that these systems are able to kind of map out the molecular level of these things and then project forward or backwards. So it makes sense, at least it made sense to me, that this machine has to then scan the subatomic, like down to the particle of everything that it touches, and that's how it's able to extrapolate these projections, which, I mean, is a lot to think about.
These scenes of the red and the blue and the green, like, I don't know what the purpose of those lights is, but this is what we saw at the start of episode 4. And so it seems like even the structure of the show itself fits within this idea of the branching timelines and things possibly changing or breaking down. This is far in the past. Lyndon is still working there. Throughout this episode, we go back to this scene of them doing whatever they're doing with this dead rat. It's clearly the first time that they are proving a practical application of the quantum computer system. And so to me, the way I interpret all this is they're giving, if you look in the cause and effect of the tram lines, they're giving the computer system a limited series of inputs, right? And those are objects in the present. And then what they're asking the computer to do is simulate the present. Like, take those inputs and simulate them in a quantum sense. And when that works, then they can start simulating backward in time and also simulating forward in time. That's why they're looking down at the molecular level and they're looking for gaps or errors in the simulation, because once they get a perfect simulation of the present reality, that is the cause, and they can, or that is the effect, and they can go look at the cause, or if they treat that present as the cause, they can look at the future effects.
The interesting part here is where they decide that they're going to expand the scanning range, which, like, Lyndon very kind of glibly is like, oh, no harm it can do, which, sorry, my dude, totally not true. And he says that, like, oh, we'll run out of memory quickly, but, I mean, think of the implications that that has then in the rest of the show, because we are seeing projections of absolutely everything. Like, we're seeing projections of everybody. Which
there's no longer any limits.
Right, this machine has scanned the world, which, I mean, privacy concerns aside, that's astronomical.
So based on the limited inputs that they were feeding it in this flashback scene, they were able to extrapolate and expand and simulate the entire room down to the computer simulating Forrest. They have not input that data. The computer does not know that Forrest is there. There's no camera on his face, right? It's simply taking the data. At that point, the computer has the data of the rat and the other objects and the data of its own existence, I guess. And from that, it extrapolates Forrest.
That in itself is kind of proving the deterministic outlook, because there's no unconnected element in a deterministic universe, right? Like, every single thing is related to every single thing, regardless of, like, actual physical proximity or what have you. So I guess, like, in a sense that this is proving the kind of, this is the proving of the theory, is the fact that you could scan a selection of 5 or 6 tiny items and then have this deterministic computer like figure out the entire world based on this very, very minimal input.
Well, it's figuring out
it's
figuring out the world of that room, but what it does is it provides, like, it goes back to the lecture scene from Katie's college, right? Where she's saying the Everett interpretation is the one that has the math, it has the evidence, it has the experiments that back it up. And the professor says,
but it's not supported by the real world.
And this makes me think that this maybe is in Katie's mind at least, the purpose of the devs unit, because we don't see it. We see that right after when Forrest pitches Katie on this idea and says, is this possible? And Katie says yes, but we still, even now in episode 5, we're not seeing what in Forrest's mind the purpose. What did he pitch her? What did he ask? Whether it's possible, we don't know. But to Katie, the purpose might be simply proving determinism. And so for the computer to be able to extrapolate anything based on these limited inputs is proof of that. What it makes me wonder is in the present, when as you said, they're going anywhere in the world, anywhere in time, it seems like, what are the inputs now? Have they just is it just the whole internet, for example, right? Could the quantum computer analyze the entire internet, crunch all that data, and now it can extrapolate anything? We got some really cute scenes throughout this episode of Forrest and his daughter, Amaya, which led me to instantly intuit that we were also going to finally find out what happened to her, because you can't have all these cute scenes without having some crushing tragedy to balance them out, because this is not a happy show. It was a car accident, and we see it happen, and it's horrendous.
It puts even more context on Forrest's obsession. Both cars ran the stop sign, but Forrest...
Yeah, the Volvo. I'm a Volvo guy, and I felt bad for that Volvo, but the Volvo ran the stop sign, too.
But, I mean, in Forrest's mind, obviously, like, the thing that he says to his wife right before it happens is, she's saying, we can talk about this in 30 seconds when I'm home, and he's like, oh, we can just talk about it now, like, being very kind of glib and off the cuff about distracting his wife with his phone. And so, like, that's something that you would never be able to let go. If you were, talking to someone on their phone while they were driving, knowing full well that you're kind of being distracting, and then something terrible happens, naturally, regardless of how true this is or not, you're going to take responsibility for that. And so Forrest...
Yeah, he blames... Yeah. I mean, clearly he blames himself. Like, most people can probably talk on the phone and not run a stop sign, especially one down the street from her house.
Exactly.
Right? You would know that stop sign's there. You would have gone through that stop sign
1,000,000 times.
1,000,000,000 times. So it's just a horrific accident, and I don't think it's his fault, you know?
Right. And I think, I mean, in the context of the show and in the context of a deterministic universe, I think we could literally look at this and say that his being on the phone with his wife in that moment was the very literal, you know, like physical cause of, you know, in the sense that if the car crash was the effect, you could say that the phone call was the cause. So, which is brutal.
So what does it mean that Katie is... What does it mean then that Katie is watching all these different versions of
Right,
it?
yeah, I don't know. I think that the conversation we get in, you know, the next scene with Katie and Forrest at the Debs unit, and they have that really poetic discussion about how Forrest needs to know that the deterministic universe is true because that's the only way he'll be able to forgive himself. And then Katie presents herself as a lawyer for the defense, which I think is a fantastic way to say it. But I think that might play into why Katie is watching alternate versions of it, is because she's also, as, you know, kind of zealous as she is about what they're doing, she also has to be the one to kind of keep Forrest's own ambitions in check, or keep Forrest's own guilt from corrupting the data, because the data is what is most important to Katie.
Well, she believes in the tram lines wholeheartedly, but she also believes in the multiple worlds. I think she truly doesn't believe that it's Forrest's fault. And so I think her trying to reassure him in this scene is genuine.
I think so too.
And she probably also, I mean, like, she clearly looks at him as a father figure, and they have a complicated relationship where he effectively put her through college and hired her when she was young, and that was, you know, maybe a decade ago, maybe longer. So their whole thing is complex and really interesting.
It's super interesting. And I have to say that this episode I liked Katie beforehand. I love Katie. Katie is now my favorite character in the show, I think. She's just so cool, and that whole conversation about her being a witness was fantastic. The fact that she's able to then, like, show Forrest the kind of kicker in this scene, I guess is what you would say, is the fact that they're able to project a version of the mouse that's still alive. We can't tell in the context of the moment if they're projecting a version of the past mouse before it died, or a version of an alternate mouse.
First of all, they're not looking at, like, a crystal clear image of the mouse. And so it seems like and obviously this is in the past when Lyndon still works there, so they clearly have not applied the Everett math to the system yet. And so it doesn't seem like this would be a mouse from a different branch where the mouse is still alive. It seems like they're just projecting into the past, I think.
I mean, maybe, yeah.
There's also that scene between Katie and Forrest and Kenton, and this is one of the few scenes in this episode that I think I can say firmly is in the present of the show. It's after Kenton and Jamie's ordeal earlier in the episode. Kenton is worried about going to prison, but he, for some reason, is letting his employer know that he's out for himself. I felt like it was a weird move on Kenton's part to be like, what he's saying effectively is, if it comes down to it, I will sell you out, right? I will talk if it means avoiding going to prison for the things that I have done over the past, 3 days or whatever.
Absolutely. But then immediately Katie is, she just says, you don't need to worry about going to prison, Kenton, because she knows. Like, they both Forrest and Katie know that whatever happens in the future does not involve Kenton going to prison. It might involve him dying.
Yeah,
it might involve anything, but it does not involve him going to prison.
Yeah. They know something he doesn't know, and they're not going to tell him what it is. I wonder whether Kenton knows that they actually know.
I don't think because that's what I got out of this scene, is the fact that Kenton is on a completely different page than the other two. Like, I don't think Kenton has any involvement in the projections or what's actually happening, in the science-y side of things. I think Kenton is very much like the boots on the ground, like, realist who's not interested in that stuff.
I will act in a self-interested manner.
The final moments of this episode are another flashback between Lily and her dad, and we actually get to see her dad in the hospital, and he has this very pointed conversation with her where he says that no man steps in the same river twice, which is a Greek proverb, I suppose you would call it, but it's about the fact that the river is not the same and the person who is stepping in it is not the same, regardless of where they are in time or, literally crossing the exact same river, which obviously goes right hand in hand with the Everett interpretation of the world.
It doesn't.
Every cause and effect. Yeah, I mean, I guess what do you take away from that?
I think that the point is that it's ambiguous. Like you can look
Sure.
at it and you can apply to that and say a river is not the same river in multiple different branches, and it relates back to one hair on Jesus's head or every one hair on Amaya's head. One rock being in a different place on the bottom of that river because of a fish taking a right turn instead of a left turn 5 million years earlier. It's technically not the same river, but that's obviously not the way that Lily's father intends it. So what he's actually saying is just the linear passage of time is enough to change the river, because each molecule of water is in a different place than it was in any infinitesimal fraction of a second earlier. So nothing is ever the same. No person is ever the same. I'm not the same person I was 5 seconds ago, right?
Sure. There's so much happening in this show.
It was a cool scene though. And then we saw Jamie talking to his family very intelligently. Lily is the reckless person, and Jamie is not taking any of this lightly, especially after his visit from Kenton. And he's intelligently telling his family to get lost for a while in the hopes that nothing will happen to them, because he already has an idea of what despite how clearly terrified he was of Kenton and how he definitely... he knows that they already killed Sergei, and he just saw what they did to Lily, and he's extremely aware that this will most likely get him killed. He goes to break Lily out.
I loved this entire conversation because it put a cherry on top of how different Lily and Jamie are as people. Like, if you stand Jamie's phone call up with his parents up to Lily's phone call with her mom, it's like a mirror image.
They're both lying.
Like the exact opposite. Right, they're both lying, but they're lying for completely different reasons.
Yeah.
In like a completely different way. And then we also get Jamie pulling a Lily and breaking her out. Like, she's been climbing through his window for the past, couple days, trying to sneak into his apartment. And then he has to do the same thing to break her out of this mental institution. So, maybe he
has to get on her level to try to get her out of this situation. It was also interesting to me, the symbolism of that, along with how vulnerable she was in that scene. She wasn't sitting by the window waiting to escape, right? The window was just open. It's like she could have left if she wanted to, but she's clearly feeling defeated. She's clearly been drugged. She's not even wearing pants, and so literally like incapacitated mentally, not even clothed. Like, you can't. There is almost no more vulnerable state than that, which kind of it just turns the whole thing into Jamie saving her, getting to her level, and it becomes almost a romantic thing, even though clearly it seems like he still feels that way about her, even if she doesn't feel that way about him. And so it's going to be interesting to see how she reacts to this. And of course, the entire thing is framed still as Katie watching projections on the machine, and so she knows all of this. She literally is watching Jamie break Lily out. She checks again. She gets a crystal clear image for the first time that we've seen of Lily's impending death, which is now less than 48 hours away. And we see for the first time that Lily is apparently going to die within the dev's unit. She's crawling around the outer, the floor with the gold leaf and the weird texture.
Which is a vacuum seal, so there's no air in there, which is a little horrifying.
Yeah, so she's probably suffocating. Really good point. Oof. And the last shot is Katie getting this little smirk on her face.
Tram lines are still intact.
Yeah, that's what it made me think. Katie is worried that they've changed something. That's kind of the theme of this episode. And at the end, she realizes, I think the way I interpreted this is the tram lines are intact. Things are, proceeding according to plan.
Yep, which is extremely bleak. If anything, it's just the darkest possible version of events is just continuing to march on.
So we're going to be back next week breaking down Devs episode 6. Of course, in the meantime, leave us a comment below, hit us up on Twitter. I am Rogue Cheddar and Meg is Rusty Polished. Thanks for watching.